Hello, this is Kate For. I will be doing a presentation on the exhibition Gordon Matta-Clark, You Are the Measure. This show was held at the Whitney in New York City in the year 2007. It was curated by Elizabeth Sussman, who is currently a curator at the Whitney still. This show was a retrospective and was held post-mortem after the artist had died. A little bit of background on Gordon Matta-Clark. He was the son of two artists. His father was a very famous Chilean surrealist, Roberto Matta, but they didn't get along very well. His father wanted him to be an architect, and he studied architecture at Cornell, but it didn't work out that well for him. He didn't have much interest in being an architect and ended up moving on to art. But he was still influenced by architecture, particularly the concept of anarchitecture, which is obviously a compound word between anarchy and architecture. Basically, a radical approach to architecture that is less focused on hegemony and more focused on activism and personal behavior. And he moved to New York City during a period of empty and derelict buildings caused by urban renewal. This was a big part of his career, and urban renewal was the process of basically getting rid of buildings that were deemed slums and unworthy. This, of course, disproportionately impacted the poor and people of color. Matta-Clark took advantage of this, all of the derelict empty buildings, and had 10 intense years of what was referred to as a mercurial practice, where he continually was precisely slicing and quartering buildings that were scheduled for demolition, opening and transforming these previously closed, enclosed spaces, and making these artworks that commented on their architectural value. And these 10 years were incredibly successful. Unfortunately, they were cut short when Matta-Clark died of cancer at age 35. So this is obviously an artist who it's very difficult to organize an exhibition on. Most of the work is both architectural sized, the scale of buildings or large chunks of buildings, and was also very ephemeral. A lot of the buildings that he had worked on were demolished shortly after he completed them, as was scheduled. So there are these works that existed for a very short period of time, and you only have photographic documentation. Another challenge is moving the architecture into a gallery space or a museum space. Typically, when one is engaging with architecture, it is on the scale of buildings, outdoors, with the building or the building-like object as a whole. Putting this work into the context of a gallery is not commonly done and is an interesting challenge. Another issue that arises from making an exhibition of Gordon Matta-Clark's work is the inherent politics of the work and how these politics might conflict with the museum in which they are displayed. This work is obviously heavily about architecture and what is slated for destruction. The Whitney Museum happens to be in a part of New York that was heavily altered during the period of urban renewal, down in Tribeca. A lot of old factories and places of living were cleared out during the 60s and 70s in order to put more desirable buildings there, according to the city. And of course, the Whitney was one of the places that has now found its home here. So how does a show address that it is in the location that the artwork is about? So the exhibition took a couple of approaches. Sorry, I'm reading my notes. So works that were gallery sized and had been saved from the destruction that befell most of Matta's work were displayed in the gallery. For instance, pieces of buildings that had been carved off and preserved were able to be transported to the Whitney to be shown. Ephemera such as drawings that were done thinking about works, or just drawings done to hash out concepts that Matta-Clark were thinking about, were included in this exhibition as well. He drew a lot of very abstracted trees, which is very interesting, as a lot of his work is very focused on architecture. Another piece that was included was several chunks of his hair. He had documented the process of cutting off a lot of his hair in order to have a piece based around that. He didn't end up doing anything with the hair, but he did have a friend extensively document the process of cutting off the hair. And it's a different way of approaching his work than a lot of his building pieces were, where you're carving off large chunks of architectural things. But it's a similar concept of reshaping something, in this case, the human body. Photography was used extensively. I'm going to go back to this slide, and you can see that there are a lot of photos on the wall. And a lot of his pieces were documented while they existed, and of course, the process of cutting them open. So you can have these photographs that show what happened as a way of documenting past events that have now gone by. So how successful was this approach? I think my opinion is that it succeeded in some ways and failed in others. I think as far as putting together an exhibition about an artist who works so ephemerally, so large scale, and in such a urban environment, I'm not sure how better I would arrange this in a gallery, purely aesthetically. I think bringing in chunks of the building works very well, as you can, have these reminders of what happened. I think it loses a lot of the context of the original space that he created, particularly in the gallery environment. You don't get the context of the whole building and the context of the urban landscape, as even though the Whitney is situated in this location where a lot of the work was executed, it doesn't have the same impact. In the gallery, you're sheltered a lot from the space outside. I think perhaps, not that I'm trying to reorganize the Whitney, but I think a gallery that had more emphasis on windows and exterior, where you could see the space outside and see the urban landscape, would have helped contextualize this work a lot better. I think there's also a failure to address all of the politics of it. Obviously, the work has the politics ingrained in, but in my researching, I didn't see a lot of acknowledging the location and the role the Whitney's sponsors had in, the urban renewal and the process of clearing out these buildings to make way for bigger and better things. And I think more acknowledgement of that would have perhaps been a more responsible exhibition. On the other hand, I think this exhibition does a decent job, a very good job of capturing the career of an artist whose life was cut short. While looking through the works curated into this show with various drawings and photographs and lots of partially formed things like the hairpiece, you get the sense that this is someone who was working very hard for a short period of time and didn't necessarily get the chance to do everything he intended to do, and had several parts of his process unresolved. And I think that is probably a very important thing for understanding Matta-Clark and his work, and, understanding understanding that, understanding the trajectory of his career. I think it's a challenge to curate a show where, specifically a retrospective, where there isn't a clean-cut, coherent ending. It was tragic and senseless that his career stopped when it did. So it's important to be able to acknowledge that his career ended before a logical conclusion. Anyway, that's my presentation. Sorry, I stumbled through it. I'm very tired. Thank you, and I'll see you in class.